Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Richard Goldberg, Senior Advisor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, we have a really important conversation. As we all know, Israel and Hamas have been at war now for about 3 weeks since Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel. And I do want to talk about two specific countries and how they're involved in this. First, Iran and Qatar. Let's talk about Iran first. President Joe Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, reportedly said Iran was, quote, complicit in Hamas's October 7th attack in a, quote, broad sense. The U.S. and Iran, as we all know, haven't had a diplomatic relationship since 1980. So how does this attack and this situation that's currently unfolding in the Middle East factor into the U.S. and Iran's relationship now?
Well, I think it's a resetting moment for a lot of Americans who had fallen into a misperception and the policy direction of the last few years that we were able to have some sort of diplomacy with this regime that would moderate the regime. Obviously, Americans of a certain generation remember the hostage crisis. I was born just after the hostage crisis, so I don't remember it, but it was something in my upbringing that I knew about. When you get a little older, you remember some very spectacular, horrific terrorist attacks directed by Iran through some of these proxies that you're hearing about in the news right now, like Hezbollah. We just marked the anniversary of the Beirut embassy bombings. Of course, we had the Marine barracks bombings as well in Beirut back in 1983. Fast forward into the 1990s, Americans killed at Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, again, Iran behind that. And so we had thought of Iran as this terror sponsor, hostage taker for many years. And we knew that this very radical ideology of death to America, death to Israel, was something we needed to defend ourselves against. The rise of Iran's nuclear program and their ballistic and cruise missile program started to change that dynamic a little bit. This terror sponsoring radical regime was looking for leverage over the West, and they found that leverage in developing a nuclear weapons capability. And we had come together on a bipartisan basis for a good decade to impose sanctions, try to contain or undermine this regime, to really deny them the tools, the access, the resources to continue with that nuclear program, in addition to their missiles, in addition to their terrorism and their hostage taking. And then we had that Iran nuclear deal in 2015, and it was an interruption to sort of our view of the world, where we fell into partisan ideology because it was President Obama's deal. It did get bipartisan opposition in the Congress at the time, but once it was there, and it was the president of the Democratic Party, the leader of the Democratic Party, pushing for this, and then we went into a very partisan, divisive election in 2016, Trump and Clinton, Trump getting out of that deal. So it became a very polarized issue all of a sudden, really just looking at the nuclear side of the equation. This is a moment, I think, to reset all those assumptions. If you had believed that it was possible to go through with that Iran nuclear deal, offer this regime some money, maybe it would back off on its hostile actions towards the West, that illusion should be gone at this point, because all that money that you make available to the regime gets poured into things like terrorism, like hostage taking, like sponsoring Hamas. But the comment that they're responsible in a broader sense misses a little bit of the details here. They're also responsible in a very specific sense. Iran, we know, coordinates Hamas, Hezbollah, and Islamic Jihad in an intelligence center in Beirut. They set that up in 2021. We have Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iranian officials talking to the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and telling them that Iran was involved in the planning of this massacre. We just saw a spectacular Wall Street Journal expose on the IRGC training Hamas terrorists in Iran. So you put that picture together and we see, in fact, Iran's fingerprints all over this massacre, but of course, the bigger picture of needing to lock down all the resources for this terror sponsoring regime.
I think the next question I have for you is a simple one, but probably the most important one, and that would be what can and what should the United States do to stop Iran from stopping to fund terror groups?
Yeah, the first thing we need to do is try to stop having two different policies that contradict ourselves when it comes to Iran. I think the White House right now is being challenged on these assumptions that they've held that they can at one point offer Iran cash to try to keep them from advancing their nuclear program, the secret nuclear deal that we learned about over the summer that was happening, that's $6 billion for 5 American hostages, things like that of trying to make nice with the regime, hoping that it will improve its behavior, and at the same time saying, this is a horrible, evil act that's just been committed by Hamas, and we're going to get tough on Hamas here. Hamas is the subsidiary. Iran is the parent company. And so what we have to do is unify the policy. Yes, go after Hamas. Yes, support Israel in going after Hamas, but also look at the broader tentacles and the broader octopus that is the Islamic Republic of Iran. The head sits in the capital of Tehran. And so what we should do is look at all the different valves of cash and revenue that we have opened up under some of the policies of the last couple of years, bank accounts that have been unfrozen, oil transfers on tankers going to China, petrochemical sales. There's a UN Security Council resolution. We can bring back into force all sorts of UN sanctions as well to add international pressure. These are the kinds of things that we should be talking about, not trying to continue to hold on one hand the offer of some sort of a nuclear deal, at the other hand talking about cracking down on terrorism sponsorship. You can't do both.
You're saying making nice doesn't work, but I'm curious as to what you think about sanctions, because the Atlantic Council wrote this. Despite being heavily sanctioned, Tehran has continued to provide more than $700 million annually to support terrorist groups, including Lebanese Hezbollah, and up to $100 million annually to Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist groups. What type of sanctions do you think would work here then?
Yeah, twofold. And if you go back to the thesis in the maximum pressure campaign, it really starts with a basic question that I think once you ask it out loud, it becomes obvious what the answer should be and what the policy should be. Are we better off with Iran, the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, trying to pursue nuclear weapons and long-range missiles to attack the United States, plotting to assassinate former U.S. officials and the lot? Are we better off with that country having more money or less money? Obviously, the answer is we're better off if they have less money, fewer resources to have to choose between of when they're going to make a payment to Hezbollah or to Hamas or to build a missile or to do nefarious things, while at the same time having to still run a country with most people in the population hating their guts and hoping to see them brought down one day. And so we did see during the era of maximum pressure, a lot of pressure come to bear on the proxies as well. The idea that you didn't see budget downturns for terrorists is not true. We saw reports out of Lebanon that Hezbollah was basically passing the plate among the community because they were falling on some hard times with cash shortages coming from Tehran at certain points. And you flip that coin around. We've seen reports that since the Biden administration was opening up all the spigots of cash under the nuclear deal that they're in, that the support to Hamas potentially went up this year from $100 million to some reports saying $350 million. So it stands to reason, it is logical, that if you deny resources to this regime, if you try to create economic and financial pressure on this regime, destabilize this regime from inside itself, you are better off as a country because Iran is not emboldened at that point. They're not on the offense at that point. They're on defense. They're back on their heels. And with a really ideologically radical regime that hates us so much, that is at war with us every day, you want that country on its heels, not on its front foot.
I think my next question would be, obviously we aren't geographically in the region, but how much responsibility do you think the United States bears to squelch a broader war within the Middle East from actually happening?
Yeah, it's a great question. What is the U.S. interest here? What is Iran to us in all of this? It's a direct threat to the United States. We should be clear on that. In the same way that people ignored North Korea for so many years, and suddenly they have nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles, and it's a threat we can never ignore because it's a threat to the U.S. homeland. Iran is 10 times worse with those capabilities if they acquire them. They are building intercontinental ballistic missiles. They call it a space launch vehicle program today, but that's their intent, that's their goal. They want nuclear weapons. If you think the Middle East is a disaster today, if you think we're already being deterred in certain areas, when they're hunting down Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, Brian Hook, the former special envoy for Iran, with bounties on their heads trying to kidnap Iranian Americans out of New York. You should read some of the Justice Department filings in the last couple of years. If you think that's not a threat today, imagine that country with intercontinental ballistic missiles tipped with nukes pointed at us. Their ability to shut down flows of commerce in the Persian Gulf, to start wars and invade countries throughout the Middle East because they have nuclear weapons at that point. So all of that is incredibly destabilizing to our security, to our economy, to our freedom. And remember, this is a regime that says death to America, death to Israel. Not death to Israel, death to America. We are the great Satan in their ideology. Israel is the little Satan. And so when we see Iran rising up trying to attack the one democracy in the region that is actively working to sabotage their nuclear weapons program every day, why they're doing that. They want Israel distracted. They have the freedom of movement to continue to grow their Middle East, to project their power, and ultimately cross that nuclear threshold. And that is a direct threat to the United States of America and every American.
When it comes to this broad conversation of the Israel-Hamas war and Iran brought into it, what do you think's missing from the national and international dialogue when it comes to Iran?
Well, right now, I think in general, putting the pieces together, instead of just calling it Hamas, a Palestinian organization, or Gaza and Palestinians, but really branding it what it is, the Iran-backed Hamas, the Iran-backed Hezbollah, the Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen, who saw cruise missiles fired off from Yemen in the last few days. Really understanding that Iran is running this war. It's Iran's war on Israel right now, but a broader coordination with China, with Russia. We see Iranians going back and forth to Beijing and to Moscow. Hamas is now going back and forth. We saw Hamas show up in Moscow. And so understand that all of the countries out there that we think about, I know we focus a lot on China, and we should. It's our number one threat. They're all coordinating with Iran as well. And so understand that we have a local threat in the Middle East. We have a threat to the United States long term, but we also have that broader global dynamic of axes that are looking to unseat the United States working together. And to the extent we can talk to our allies in Europe and say, hey, we're going to reset our policies here. We're not going to continue down this road of appeasement. We're not going to keep offering cash in hopes that they don't go across a certain nuclear threshold. It's not working. It's not working. It's making us less safe to do that. Let's work together in reimposing sanctions. Let's trigger the snapback, as it's called, of all the UN sanctions on Iran. And let's work together to provide a credible military threat against the regime, to let them know we're not scared. We're not going to be running scared. This is not a giant at this point. We have time to prevent them from becoming a real threat that we can't control at that point. And that means making sure the leadership in Tehran knows we're willing to use force as a bottom line if they move towards that nuclear threshold, if they launch attacks that kill Americans and take Americans hostage. This is a threat to us. It's a threat to our allies. It's a threat to democracy. And we have to take it seriously.
I do now want to pivot a bit and talk about Qatar's involvement in all of this. After Hamas's attack, Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited Qatar. An Iranian official also visited Qatar. Can you talk about what Qatar's role is really as a mediator in this situation?
I take temperature of the people around me, and I think most people in this country probably have never heard of Qatar other than the World Cup, maybe. And so, first it's important to understand, who is Qatar? What is Qatar? Where is this place? It's like a little fingernail in the Persian Gulf, and it's half the size of New Hampshire, and yet an oil and natural gas rich Arab country there. And they're sort of the Swiss bankers to the Nazis of the modern age. You could also make a comparison to what the Saudis were like in the 1990s, pre 9/11, where they're friends with everybody. It is really like a Star Wars bar in the Middle East when you go to Doha, their capital. You could be in a hotel. Americans, other Westerners, Iranians, Hamas, the Taliban, they're all welcome. They all have offices, they all have operations, and they all get financial support of some kind. And that's the double game of Qatar. Now, right after 9/11, to move Central Command forward as we were going to launch our campaign to Afghanistan and eventually against Iraq as well, and Qatar welcomed us to set up an air operations center. And it started as something makeshift, and over 20 years, it's been built into a major artery of U.S. air operations in the Middle East. That's what's called a CAOC, a Combined Air Operations Center, just outside Doha. That has given the Qataris a lot of leverage, but it's not entire leverage. We can move that base over time if we wanted to. We already have a base in the UAE nearby as well, called Al Dhafra. So in that context, what has happened is Qatar has come to us and said, we're your friend. We host you. We're a military ally here because of your base. We have a lot of money pouring into U.S. universities, think tanks, investment firms. We want to be friends with you. But you know what? It's good for you that we're also friends with really bad people, your enemies. Throughout the 2010s, we found evidence that they were financing al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria and Iraq during the war on ISIS in Syria. Obviously, at some point, the Israelis came to them and said, Hamas has taken over the Gaza Strip. After Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005 and Hamas took over by armed force in 2007, nobody knew what to do with Gaza. You're going to have a humanitarian crisis. We can't give Hamas any money. They're a terrorist organization. So Qatar stepped forward and said, we have an idea. These are our friends. These are our Muslim Brotherhood allies. We're ideologically aligned with Hamas. Al Jazeera, which you've probably heard about in the news that spreads such anti-American hate, that is funded by Qatar. It's based in Qatar. And so they said, we'll host Hamas. Let their political leadership, quote unquote, like a terrorist organization has diplomats, have this leadership come and stay in Doha, and they'll hold meetings here. And we'll pay hundreds of millions of dollars every year to help support the Hamas government. And this policy will help moderate Hamas. And we'll be able to have a channel with them. And if they take people hostage, we can do hostage negotiate. It's going to work out great. Well, anybody who believed that for all these years should have a major wake-up call on October 7th. And all assumptions, just like Iran, should be reset with Qatar as well. And so what does that mean? It means we have to be honest with ourselves. It doesn't work if you empower friends to be friends with our enemies, to be friends with terrorists, and not just be friends, but give them safe harbor and financial support. So now we're going to have to reset this policy and say to Qatar, by the way, Turkey as well, that does similar things, no more offices for Hamas, no more leaders walking around in Doha. They can't be in your country, no money flowing to Hamas or its various affiliates. And if you don't listen to us, if you don't shut these spigots down, there will be consequences, because policy now is the elimination of Hamas, not the containment, appeasement, or moderation of Hamas.
Richard, I really have to say, this is the best explanation I've heard of Qatar's involvement within the past 3 weeks. So thank you for laying it out that way. And if Qatar is friendly with everybody, what's a win in Qatar's eyes then?
Well, right now, what I fear is the hostage negotiations that they have, sort of stepped up to the plate, so boldly. The arsonist playing firefighter, saying we can host this. We have good offices with Hamas. Their leadership is here. We'll get more people out. Maybe we'll get the American citizens out. Maybe we'll get other foreign passport holders out. Maybe we can get some women and children out in exchange for some Hamas terrorists in Israeli prisons. They're using that as a way of giving themselves cover, buying time, getting good PR, because 2 old women get let out of 222 hostages, and Hamas says they're doing it because Qatar asked, and the international media praises Qatar, and all the hostage families are being told every day, don't be mean to Qatar, they're our only hope. You need to thank them for what they're doing. So the Qataris are buying their way out of the mess that they've already put themselves in. And so the question I really have is, are we going to let them get away with it? We're in a tough spot with the hostages. That's absolutely true. My policy, if I was in charge, would be to put enormous pressure on Qatar, not thank them, and say, we hold you responsible right now. Everybody who dies is on you. And we will extract consequences for every death later on. Thank you very much. Get the unconditional release of all hostages. We're not doing that. We're saying, oh, wow, thank you so much. What's going to happen? We got to talk to you after this is all over about your relationship with Hamas, but we'll put that off for now. Let's keep working on the hostages. So I fear this undermines Israel's military response. It delays any response. It gets Qatar potentially off the hook with great PR at the end of this to maybe not even cut their ties with Hamas. And it really sort of questions, for me, what is American policy today towards Hamas? Do we agree with Israel that our policy is to eliminate Hamas? Or are we sort of tolerating a major Israeli retaliation for October 7th, short of an elimination, and hedging on what's going to happen afterwards with Hamas still there? I think that's a very important policy question for the White House to have to answer.
If Hamas has a political office in Doha, what is Qatar's relationship with Iran? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So the Qataris have pretty close coordination at this point with the Iranians. It's grown over time. They've always tried to play nice, as other countries in the region oftentimes do, because they feel vulnerable in the area. The Omanis very similarly have played the Switzerland-type role between Iran and the other Arab powers in the past. But the Qataris went through a period of real Arab strife. You'll remember the Saudis under Mohammed bin Salman, when he became crown prince, took on Qatar over all of these activities and thought that if they sort of imposed an economic embargo, went after Qatar on the world stage politically, they could pressure the Qataris and get other countries to pressure the Qataris to cut off all of these links to the Muslim Brotherhood network, including Hamas and ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They could get Al Jazeera to stop doing all kinds of reporting that undermines Arab moderate leaders in the Middle East, that attacks Israel, as Saudi saw a vision towards the Abraham Accords even then, and saw Al Jazeera as a major antagonist towards Arab governments being willing to make peace with Israel. And so that period of time, Qatar decided, rather than make concessions on these issues, to stay firm, poured a ton of money into DC lobbyists and PR firms to fight back, engaged in a lot of hacking of Americans and others that we saw come out via press leaks, and then turned to Iran and said, let's increase our trade, but also let's increase our coordination. And so just as an example, Al Jazeera signed a coordination agreement at the time with the Iranian state news network, and that holds today. And so disinformation, propaganda, amplifying anti-American voices is actually done in coordination between the Qataris and the Iranians. So it's not exactly, they're completely in a marriage together. It's a marriage of convenience, so to speak. But ideologically, let's also remember that Iran has, over its time, jumped the ideological sectarian divide between Shia Islam, which is Iran, and Sunni Islam, which is most of the rest of the Arab world, including Hamas. It's interesting to note, Shia radicals in Tehran are investing in and supporting Sunni radicals in Gaza, in the same way that the Qataris are ideologically aligned with those Sunni radicals in Gaza. And so they both share this vision of the destruction of Israel. And so they have shared aligned goals. And so in the same way that Iran was able to cross over and make allyship with Hamas, so too the Qataris have crossed over to make allyship with Iran.
What you've laid out in this conversation is a really precarious situation, obviously. There are still around 200 hostages in Gaza. A war is unfolding in front of our very eyes. What are you watching out for next? What's the most important thing you're looking for?
Yeah, I think two things. One is, are we going to be able to deter the Iranians from continuing to push not just what they're doing themselves, but their proxies, the attacks on American bases? We're watching closely in Iraq and Syria, whether the Yemeni Houthis that they've trained and provided missiles to will continue to fire missiles from Yemen, so Israel faces another front. Most importantly, whether they will push Hezbollah on the northern front to open a major scale war with hundreds of thousands of rockets and missiles raining down on Israel from the north, and what that will mean for Israeli operations and their stated objective of taking out Hamas. So being able to establish that deterrence, give the Israelis some freedom of movement to go and complete their objectives in Gaza versus Hamas without having to fight a 2, 3, or 4 front war will be very important to watch in the coming days. And U.S. roles and policies come into play, whether or not that's going to be successful. The other piece, of course, is the hostages. This is the most heartbreaking piece of all of it, and we knew that the minute we heard there was hostages, let alone 200 hostages or more, that this was Hamas's greatest leverage, along with their allies. And so my heart will break throughout this process, seeing how that plays out. It's already obviously delayed Israeli military actions to some extent. How much longer that delays, how Hamas plays that, how Qatar plays that, these are questions that I have, and they're not exactly knowable right now, and we'll see how it plays out.
Richard Goldberg, I want to thank you so much for your insights today. As the situation continues to evolve, I hope you come back on and continue the conversation. Richard, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.